Here at the Tylösands summit, the issue is the Age of Insecurity, and many of the senior leaders gathered here behind closed doors are wrestling with whether to understand the nature of what you could call the new normal in so many areas. But history has many lessons. And I'm joined by Professor Margaret MacMillan, who's Warden of St Antony's College in Oxford, but also an eminent historian, particularly of the First World War. Margaret, what is the message that you've been giving to these leaders who are wondering if history really does have messages for them about what to do?
Well, I'm impressed that they've asked a historian to talk to them, and I think that shows that they have an open mind about it. My own view about history is it can do two things. It can help us to understand issues, understand ourselves, understand those we're dealing with. Without those tools, I think we're not going to have much hope of actually making sense of the world. And I think the other thing history can do is open up possibilities, help us ask the what ifs. What if, for example, Russia and China decide to form a strong friendship? Have they done it before? Is it likely? What if the United States decides to become more isolationist? It's done it before. Is that likely to happen again? So I think what history can do is both that depth of understanding, but also just opening up possibilities so we ask some good questions.
But you made a point of saying don't be complacent. And I've also heard you say elsewhere, don't be smug to the leaders who might think that they have control and command, but actually events are getting out of control.
I do think that's dangerous, and I think we've seen times in history where people have said, look, we've got a crisis, but don't worry, we'll sort it out. We've sorted it out before. But that doesn't always happen, and the First World War broke out because they couldn't sort out a particular crisis.
In 5 weeks only.
5 weeks isn't a very long time to go from a long period of peace to an all-out general war, is it?
What about what we're seeing around Europe at the moment and in the United States about populism, about resentment towards politicians and leaders in the corporate sector?
Well, I think this is something where we've clearly all missed something. We've missed the deep impact of globalization, the deep level of dissatisfaction that a lot of people have with that impact. Globalization hasn't benefited everyone. We've seen a growing disparity between rich and poor in a number of advanced countries. And I think there's a sort of anger out there that jobs are disappearing, the prospects for myself and my children are disappearing, and my standard of living is going down. And I think elites have failed really to grasp that and understand the depth of that feeling, which is what we're seeing now with the support for people like Donald Trump.
But you've made parallels to history where there are precedents for this.
We've seen precedents in the 1920s and 1930s where you had people, particularly during the Great Depression, people who felt the existing institutions weren't doing anything for them, that the existing type of government wasn't working, capitalism had failed, and they turned to extreme parties on either the right or the left in the 1930s which promised easy solutions.
But what then happens if you take that 5 weeks between the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo and the fact, as you put it here in Tylösand, that really, and you've written in your book very extensively, that really no one took it seriously, that this could lead to the scale of escalation which took place. And we're sitting very close to the Baltics with worries about Russia.
Well, one of the things we do, we're human beings, we tend to assume that what we know as normal will continue into the indefinite future. And so in 1914, they thought, well, we've had a long period of peace, no reason really why it shouldn't just continue and things go on and we get more prosperous and the world gets to be a better place. And so I think you get just a sense that the change can't happen that quickly. And I think you also get a complacency that if we have a crisis, we'll deal with it. And so far, since the end of the Cold War, we have dealt more or less okay with the crises that have been piling in on us. But we have to at least be aware of the possibility that one day we may not be able to deal with it, and we better be prepared for that.
One of the things you've said very explicitly is people are overwhelmed. Leaders are overwhelmed now. They don't have time to think. Did they have time to think in history, or did they have time just to ignore at the same time?
Well, the trouble with the crisis is things happen very quickly. You don't have time to think. But what you want are leaders who've thought before the crisis, who've had time to read, who've had a decent education, whether they've educated themselves or gone to university, it doesn't really matter, but who have some understanding of the world. I mean, I think one of the things that made Winston Churchill or Franklin Delano Roosevelt great political leaders is they'd had a lot of time in their lives to read, to think, to talk to people who knew about things, so that when they were in office with all the pressures on them, they actually had already developed an intellectual framework and a depth of knowledge.
But they didn't have social media in those days.
They didn't have social media, and they weren't expected to tweet the whole time. Now,
and they weren't accountable instantaneously.
No, and that's one of the problems. I mean, governments should not be expected to respond within 5 minutes to any major crisis. We want people who actually take time to draw a breath and think, and think, how do I deal with this?
Here, finally, this is being debated behind closed doors by a lot of very senior industrialists and public figures. What kind of message do you think you can give them which would reassure them with all this negativity that actually there is a way forward if they kind of recalibrate the way they do their business?
Well, one message I would give is that if you look at history, it won't offer a lot of comfort, but one bit of comfort it will offer is that in the past there have been times when elites or certain enlightened sections of elites have understood that change is needed and have begun to deal with some of the social and political issues and economic issues that are pressing. And I think that's what we have to hope for. I mean, these people are human beings. They may come from a particular perspective, particular background, but they want societies that work. And that's, I think, what we have to hope, that the elites will do their best to make workable societies that bring benefits to as many people as possible.
Could be a Tylösand initiative. Professor Margaret MacMillan, thank you very much indeed.